middle of the night of June 3rd and early June 4th. And the army just moves in and begins behaving very much like an army of occupation, which is something the People's Liberation Army is supposed to be the one that saves China from foreign aggression, and they're acting like an invading force.
So this is where famously the tanks roll in.
The tanks roll in, and I think also you have that famous image of the man standing in front of the tank.
Yeah.
That's a banned image within China, and I really think the reason why it's so considered so toxic by the regime is because it just shows the People's Liberation Army looking like an invading force, not like a stabilizing force.
Can we talk about that? Who's now called the Tank Man, the man that stood in front of the row of tanks. This was on June 5th in Tiananmen Square. What do we know about him? What do you think about him? The symbolism.
It's an amazing symbol. He's on this boulevard near the square with this long line of tanks, and it's unquestionably this act of incredible bravery. And there's some interesting things about it, some that are forgotten. One is that in the end, he climbs up on the tank,
Mm-hmm.
and the tank swerves, it doesn't run him over. And the Chinese Communist Party initially showed video of this and said, look, the Western press is talking about how vicious we were, but look at the restraint.
Mm-hmm.
Look at this. He wasn't mowed down. And they tried this whole story with Tiananmen initially of saying, look, the students were out of control. Everybody should remember what happened during the Cultural Revolution. And the army showed restraint. And there were a small number of soldiers who were actually burned alive in their tanks once the massacre began. People got outraged and they attacked the soldiers. But by selective use of footage, the Communist Party could say, look at this. The heroes, the martyrs were these soldiers. And they try for the first months after it to try to get this narrative to stick. They talk about Tiananmen a lot. They talk about these things. They show images of the Tank Man. The problem with it is that lots and lots of people around Beijing had seen what happened and knew that, in fact, there had first been the firing on unarmed civilians with automatic weapons. And there had been many, many people, some students, but a lot of ordinary Beijing residents and workers who were just mown down. So lots of people knew somebody who had been killed. So that story just didn't work. And then I think the claim had to be made to try to suppress discussion of the event, and particularly to repress that visual imagery that was that image of the man in front of a line of tanks. Whatever the tanks did to him or not, the main takeaway from it would be this idea that there were lines of tanks in a city that was that the image was of the government as having lost the mandate to rule, and they really didn't want to have that image out there in the world.
Yeah, we're watching the video now. He's got grocery bags in his hands. It's such a symbolic, I've had enough. Like that kind of statement.
Yeah, and it's probably not a student. It's often described as a student, but he probably was a worker. And it is a powerful, powerful image of bravery. And, I brought up the 1968 parallel for Eastern and Central Europe. There was actually a very powerful photograph of a man bearing his chest in front of a tank in Bratislava during what we think of as Prague Spring. That was a famous image of bravery against tanks. And in 1968, in Czechoslovakia, then still Czechoslovakia, the tanks that rolled in were Soviet tanks sent down there. And so, not that people would know, but that was an image, what was so powerful in that was saying, we're not going to put up with this invasion. Again, I think you have the People's Liberation Army looking like an invading force. And that's what the Chinese Communist Party, in a sense, can't deal with now, even though sometimes they could tell a story about 1989. And they do tell a version of this, and some people believe this, I think, is that in 1989, China went one route of not having the Communist Party dramatically change or relinquish control. and the Soviet Union and the former Soviet states went another. And you could say, well, look, and after 1989, the Chinese economy boomed. Life got better for people in China. Life got really terrible for a lot of people in the former Soviet blocs. Maybe this was the right way to go. And you can make that kind of argument, but if you show the tanks and the man in front of the tanks, you just have a different kind of image of heroism.
It's one of my favorite photographs or snapshots ever taken, videos ever taken, so I apologize if we linger on it. Sometimes you don't understand the symbolic power of an image until afterwards. And perhaps that's what the Chinese government didn't quite understand. They lost the information war, the meme war. So I have to ask, what do you think was going through that man's head? Was it a heroic statement? Was it a purely primal, guttural, like, I've had enough?
It's so interesting to just speculate, and we just don't know because, he was never able to be interviewed afterwards. But I think your emphasis on patriotism is really important because one of the students' main demands was then I think it might have been the thing that would have gotten them to leave the square would have been to say, we want this to be acknowledged as a patriotic, that our goals are patriotic. We're not here to take China back into the Cultural Revolution. We're here to express our love for the country if it goes in the right way. So will you admit that? And you mentioned about the power of the image, and I do think the Chinese Communist Party learned something, has taken to heart the power of the image after that, because we saw this but when there were protests in Hong Kong, the government on the mainland really wanted to tell a story there of, crowds out of control. And initially there were in 2014, and again initially in 2019, there were very orderly crowds, and it had trouble with that story. So they tried very hard to ban images of peaceful protests until there were some incidents, as there almost always are, of violence by crowds. And then they would show those images over and over again. They also worked very hard when Hong Kong protests began in the 2010s to try very hard to avoid any use of soldiers to repress them. It was all the police. And they tried very hard and managed to success because the Western press was often saying, will this be another Tiananmen? Will there be a massacre? Will there be soldiers on the streets? The movements in Hong Kong were suppressed without the use of shooting to kill on the streets. They were shooting to wound. There was beanbag shot. There were rubber bullets. There was enormous amounts of tear gas. There was even tear gas let fly inside subway stations in 2019. And all these things are really brutalizing, but they don't make the kind of images that sear in the mind the way something like the Tiananmen tank man image, or the image of a Vietnamese woman being burned by napalm, young woman that became another of the iconic images during the Vietnam War. Those images really can have an extraordinary power. And I think the Chinese Communist Party is now aware of that. There are there are very few photographs allowed of the Xinjiang extra-legal detention camps. There are very little there is an awareness of how much power a photograph of a certain type can have.
So nobody knows what happened to the tank man.
No.
What do you think happened to the tank man?
I assume he was killed.
Killed.
I assume he was just disappeared. It's interesting because very often figures are made an example of in one way or another. I mean, Liu Xiaobo was imprisoned and not allowed to, get enough medical care. So you can talk about him having, died earlier than he should have. But there's been relatively few of, like, for political crimes recently, sentencing to death and things like that. It's much more just remove them, imprison them. But the tank man, there was never a trial. There was never even a trial that was one that you knew what the result would be, which there was for Liu Xiaobo and others. Not even a hidden trial, but simply disappeared. And there's been somebody who's like another figure like this who's disappeared. A couple of years ago in Beijing, there was a lone man who put up a banner on a bridge, Sitong Bridge in Beijing, and it was extraordinary. It had denunciations of the direction Xi Jinping was taking the country. It was denunciation of COVID policies, but also of dictatorial rule. And the banner, somehow he managed to have it up and get it long enough to be filmed and to draw attention, and the film to circulate. Again, another image of the power of images. And he's disappeared, and there hasn't been a show trial or even a secret trial. And again, we don't know if he's still alive, but these are cases where I think the Chinese Communist Party really doesn't want a competing story out there. They don't want somebody to be able to answer what he was thinking.